thanks to Donald Trump. The leaders, key leaders of BRICS, President Putin, President Xi of China, Prime Minister Modi of India, met this week at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and then established very clearly that a new era in international affairs, world politics, world economics is dawning. It's coming to life. BRICS had been around for almost 10 years, and it's been an idea. It's been one of those things. Maybe nice to go to other people's countries and do some sightseeing, but it really hadn't taken on the serious aspect of being an alternative financial trading system until really a year ago in Kazan. And what happened in Kazan was a result of the preceding 2 years of sanctions against Russia and sanctions on China. As these two powerhouse nations came to realize there was nothing they could do to satisfy, placate, or make peace with the West. They were going to have to pursue their own interests and serve the interests of their own people, as opposed to shackling themselves to Washington or to Europe. But even a year ago in Kazan, while Russia and China, I think, were fully on board with the necessity in BRICS and trying to move it ahead, when Brazil took over the presidency last October, there was a lot of concern that BRICS was just going to now drift along. But Rio, the folks in Rio and Brasilia surprised everybody by scurrying around and putting together a very successful summit. And it was at the end of that summit in Rio in June that Donald Trump hit Brazil with sanctions. Now, understand it's one tariffs, but it's a form of sanction. Hitting Brazil with these tariffs made absolutely no economic sense whatsoever, because Brazil, the United States had a trade surplus with Brazil. In other words, whatever Brazil sent us, we sent more to Brazil. So that relationship from an economic standpoint was more beneficial for the United States. And yet the United States decided to single out Brazil because of domestic political issues surrounding Bolsonaro and Donald Trump deciding to intervene in the domestic political politics of Brazil. Well, that energized, infuriated President Lula, and this gave BRICS another big boost. But now we come to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting. This meeting was originally, this grouping was created, I think, originally for strictly security issues, discussions about combating terrorism and other threats. The original membership was the members of the former Soviet Union, like Belarus, Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, but it also included China and some Asian nations. But now it has grown both in size and in purpose. And clearly the stars of this year's meeting in Tianjin were Vladimir Putin, President Xi, and Prime Minister Modi. The picture are those three men having a hearty laugh together, chuckling. We have no idea what they were talking about, but they were clearly in sync with one another. And so what this means is that we now see that India, who was somewhat lukewarm, is warmed up dramatically. Now, the story of India's expanding role now with both BRICS and the SCO comes at a time where Donald Trump keeps touting that, he settled 7 wars. And one of those wars is the war between Pakistan and India, to which Prime Minister Modi and his Foreign Minister Jaishankar have strongly said, no, that's not true. The United States played no role in securing that peace. But Trump's desire to take credit for it says a lot about him. And then to follow that up with the effort to bully India into cutting off receiving supplies of oil, which are inexpensive relative to other sources, and then or else face a 50% tariff. All right, folks, hold on just a second. We've got something important to share with you. First off, a big thank you for all your incredible support. Our team's been putting in the hours, really working hard to bring you insightful guests, new and improved formats, solid, high-quality analysis every week. Our next goal, hitting that 100,000 subscriber mark and getting that silver button. Let's make it happen together. Every like, comment, share, and subscription truly helps us grow and keep improving. All right then, let's get back to the video. Trump and his advisors apparently don't know how to do basic research. Had they done the basic research, they would have understood that India's trade with the United States is not that significant. It accounts for 2.3% of Indian GDP. So, it's not nothing, but it's not a game changer in terms of the ending or destroying the Indian economy. Whereas the oil that is imported into India and refined in India, while it only represents 1.5% of the Indian gross domestic product, that oil is used to produce diesel and gasoline. Diesel fuels in particular, which are fueling the trucks that drive across India hauling goods and people. So it really occupies a critical role within the Indian economy, one that effect would be far larger than simply not trading with the United States. But it was this bullying move by the United States that further energized Prime Minister Modi, and he started talking to President Xi of China. They had conversed last year at Kazan. That was the first good opening brought about because of Vladimir Putin. But now Modi made a point. I'm going to China and I'm going to talk with the President Xi. So right there is where I said, hey, there's where Donald Trump should be nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. He's brought India and China together, who have had, to be kind, a rancorous relationship going back decades, all over territory on their shared border. But now, instead of firing at each other, ordering troops to shoot at one another, they're talking together, reopening flights between China and India, and recognizing that they're partners in something bigger than just their own mutual relationship. That is what Trump has failed to understand, that in his efforts to use tariffs to coerce these other countries, he doesn't realize that the BRICS nations do very little trade, with the exception of China, do very little trade with the United States. And here's China's in a completely different category because of its size, because of the volume of traffic, but more importantly, because of some of the specific elements, particularly pharmaceuticals, which also come out of India, magnets, rare earth minerals that are essential for U.S. production of weapons systems, communication systems for military purposes. China has slowed that down, and the United States has pulled back from hitting China with these tariffs. Because the reality is, finally, Trump or someone in his administration came to the understanding that the United States didn't have that kind of leverage anymore over China. This is not 30 years ago. 30 years ago, the majority of the world were trading partners. They were majority trading partners with the United States. Today, that picture has completely flipped, where the majority of the world are major trading partners with China, not with the United States. Clausewitz, in talking about war, talked about that, it was a dimension of politics, but other things come into play. And one of those things is now at play in the world economy, is the stagnation that's taking place in the West and the revitalization that's taking place in the East. In the past, when India or Russia or China wanted to do anything in the realm of international trade, they had to go out and buy US dollars. So that demand for dollars indirectly helped the United States finance wars around the world and finance the buildup of the Department of Defense and the Pentagon. That is now going away. One of the other aspects with respect to BRICS, as BRICS comes into its own, is the fact that when Russia sells to China and China buys from Russia, they do so in their respective currencies. They're not going out on the open market to buy dollars. The same between Brazil and India, or India and China, India, Brazil, and any of the other countries that are now part of BRICS with Iran and China. They are dealing in their own national currencies. Well, that ends up reducing the demand for dollars. And how do you boost demand for dollars? Well, you lower the price. So the reality is you've got a surfeit of dollars flooding the world and no real demand for it. Not like it was 3 years ago, for example. And one of the other aspects that came out of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization was the talks of setting up a development bank, a bank where other countries could go and get loans, get financing without having to beg the World Bank and the United States for dollars. So while BRICS was not conceived initially as a, quote, competitor to the dollar, BRICS was set up in order to prevent the United States from being able to bully and dictate the policies of countries like India, China, Russia, Brazil, South Africa, Iran, Vietnam. BRICS, we are witnessing the dawning of it's not just a new financial order, it will be a new political order. I think, as both President Putin and President Xi have made clear, this is not about establishing a new hegemon who's going to rule over and dictate to other countries what they must do, what they can do, and what they cannot do, as has been the case with the United States. Instead, it's working on creating full-fledged partnerships with countries primarily in the global South. And the intransigence of the United States and Europe means that as this BRICS phenomena grows and becomes institutionalized, the United States and Europe are going to be caught on the outside looking in. They're no longer going to have the luxury of dictating or controlling what other countries can do. Because right now, look at the threats that are facing Iran and the threats that have faced Russia, and the new threats against India and Brazil. The United States, instead of using its economic and political power for good, is instead using it to bully, to threaten, and to harm other countries. And not surprisingly, those other countries have finally had enough. And they're saying, we're not going to take this anymore.
I think we might be breaking with the last few hundred years, maybe 500 or 600 years of history in this transformation, because one of the things that is becoming obvious is that the current monetary system that we have is pretty much the source that is poisoning all other relations in society, and that it's it's the root cause of permanent wars, of misery in not only the global South, but increasingly in what we call the Golden West.
Mm-hmm.
And this is always the same thing, and it always boils down to usury, because all the money that's in circulation is created as debt. It reflects debt, and it's only growing and increasing, and it has to be paid back with interest, and that interest compounds. So the monetary system is pretty much operating like a giant conveyor belt that's sucking wealth, or a vacuum cleaner that's sucking real wealth from everywhere where it's produced, and then concentrating it with this very, very small banking cartel, which is, on the axis Wall Street and City of London, and it's inflicting misery on everybody else. And the farther it goes, the worse it gets. And so I think that the awareness of this problem is starting to spread. And I think that's largely thanks to the internet, because, we get to have this conversation. We get to publish papers. They get to be read. People talk to each other. And I read at some point, in the aftermath of the World War II, after the Bretton Woods Agreement, somebody there, maybe John Maynard Keynes or somebody, they were talking about this, and someone said, maybe Dexter White, I don't know, said, "Oh, maybe there's a dozen or so people in the whole world that understand how the monetary system actually operates." Today, maybe it's a small percentage, but it's, absolutely orders of magnitude bigger. And then, the only game in town was London and New York. The two financial centers of the world were London and New York, Paris to a lesser extent. This is who you had to deal with. If you wanted to trade, if you wanted to participate in the global economic activity, it all had to go through either New York or through London, or a little bit maybe through Paris. But that was it. Today we have real alternatives emerging, which is, the BRICS organization, China, Russia to an extent.
Well, I mean, let me ask you on that point, that China right now, the 5 largest banks in the world, I think at least 3, maybe 4 of the largest banks are Chinese banks. Are they operating according to the same, let's say, infrastructure and purpose as the banks in London and New York, or are they actually opening up sort of a new road, a new alternative?
I think they are operating on the same principle, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they are inherently and inevitably evil, because even the Western banking didn't have to become evil and pathogenic. That was a choice. It was a conscious, deliberate choice, which was made. My impression is that this choice was made kind of explicitly in the aftermath of World War II, because primarily the British, they were the ringleaders, but the American bankers tagged along and pretty much adopted the same strategy. The strategy was to take the stranglehold of strategically important commodities around the world, but especially oil, and to make sure that they control all or as much as possible of the oil production and trade. And then the choice was made deliberately to keep all resource exporting nations poor. And that was formulated by Henry Kissinger in his famous National Security Memorandum 200. I forget what year that is, but at some point, I think in the 50s. So there were initiatives by various nations. When Germany and France started to recover economically in the 50s, and Italy, they started to speak with the Iranians, with the Saudis, with the Soviets, and they wanted to develop. They wanted to exchange, let's say, take guaranteed deliveries of crude oil at a certain price that would be agreed in exchange for technology. And what countries like Iran and Brazil wanted, for example, and Mexico, they wanted to develop their nuclear technology. And all of this was nipped in the bud. This is, for example, why the Shah of Iran was overthrown, because he wanted to use the proceeds from oil sales to develop a very extensive nuclear program. The Brazilians wanted the same, the Mexicans wanted the same, and the Germans and the French were entering into contracts. And so, the banking sector could have supported that, and they wanted to support it. Like German and French bankers and industrialists were already developing all these deals around the world. So we're talking about 1950s and 1960s. And then the New York and London bankers deliberately decided to destroy all this. So, for example, there was a man called Enrico Mattei in Italy who pretty much single-handedly developed Italian energy sector. Mm-hmm. Their own indigenous oil industry. He went to Libya, he went to Syria, he went to different places, making his own contracts outside of the Seven Sisters, big oil. And then, he met an untimely death in 1956, I think, because he wouldn't stop, even though he was threatened, told to stop. Then there was a German banker who wanted to support. The idea was always, we need your resources, but we can help you develop your energy sector. We can give you technology transfer. We can build out your infrastructure. And what Henry Kissinger wrote in that NSM 200 document, NSSM, I think, no, he basically spelled out, not in those exact terms, but we're going to keep them poor and miserable, because if we don't, they're going to absorb this stuff that they produce in their own economies, and then they're going to be very expensive for us to buy. But if they're poor, then they totally depend on us, and they're going to have to sell their resources dirt cheap to us.
Yeah.
And we're going to control all the flows, and everybody's going to have to buy from us. And then, the cream on top of the cake is always that our banks are going to finance all this development, which means that all of their resources are going to be collateral on the books of our banks. And so that was done deliberately. Mm-hmm. And that's when, the heavy-handed, they just determined that nuclear was the enemy. And they decided at that point that they were going to try to slow down or stop the development of nuclear power development. And it was done that way. And that's why we had those oil shocks, 1973, 1979. Then, Volcker came into the Federal Reserve, increased the interest rate to 16%, to 20%. Basically, the effect of this was that practically it stopped dead industrial development of the global South. First, oil went from, in 1973, went up like 400%. And a lot of these countries were basing their industrial development on oil, which was, I think, $3 or $4 a barrel. And then it jumped to almost 12. And then at the end of the 1970s, it jumped a lot higher still on the back of Iran regime change, 1979.
Right.
And I think it brought it to, at some point, to $40 a barrel. So countries couldn't cope anymore. And to keep buying oil, they had to go deep into debt. So they became more and more in debt to the IMF and the World Bank and other private financial institutions in the West. And then that made them vulnerable to interest rate hike. So Volcker comes in, hikes the interest rate, and practically crashes the whole world. And then you had the big debt crisis of 1980s and everybody on the hook to the IMF and to the Western world, basically for everything, including food production.
Well, let me, let's call this the colonial legacy. Suck the resources out of the global South, out of these countries that have been, were occupied or controlled in one form or fashion by, England, France, Germany, the Netherlands, the different colonial enterprises. And those countries really didn't develop. You weren't seeing the buildup of infrastructure. It looks now that China in the lead, but with Russia, lesser extent India, but that China really is the principal driving force now it appears to be creating a new model. Now,
yes.
Some may accuse me of being naive, but I don't see the same sort of locust behavior. The locusts drive in and they eat everything. They consume it, destroy crops. And instead of destroying, it looks like they're going in and actually building up infrastructure in these countries and actually helping raise the wealth of those countries. And I think part of it is they understand if we get those countries more wealthy, they're going to buy more of our crap.
Well, yeah, that's exactly it, because I think that, first of all, if you raise living standards, then you reduce social tensions and you reduce the risk of war. If you're an advanced industrial nation, it makes sense because you're creating markets with purchasing power that are going to be buying your products. So you're creating a win-win situation where everybody, you're lifting everybody higher. But and this is almost obvious, and it was banking and industrial interests in France, Germany, and Italy during the 50s and the 70s were actually pursuing this strategy, this approach. It made total sense. We have industries, we have technology, we have the know-how, you have the resources, and we can exchange this in a mutually beneficial trade. And then as your economies develop, you're going to be buying more and more from us. But these London and New York circles, and I think it's on ideological grounds. No, I don't think it was on the ideological grounds, because they actually, this group of bankers and economists actually called themselves, they referred to themselves as neo-Malthusians. And what does that mean? That means that they were taking the ideological cue from Thomas Malthus, the East India Company economist, who was basically advocating depopulation.
Mm-hmm.
He was like, there's too much of this vermin, so we need to keep them poor and miserable, and we need to extinguish them from time to time to get rid of them all. I don't have other explanation for it other than I think there's something satanic at the core of that approach.
Mm-hmm.
And this, there's nothing inevitable about this. Banking can be a very useful service to society. It can foster growth, improving standard of living, prosperity, but it has to be, you have to make deliberate choices. Hey, let's use credit to build out infrastructure. Let's use credit to build out the energy sector, industries, and so forth. There's an old Chinese proverb that says, if you want to grow rich, first build a road.
I would say it's a Maoist, Dengist approach, in fact, which is pay attention to the grassroots all the time. Listen to what the grassroots is saying or proposing, and meritocracy. Meritocracy is essential. If you're not a true meritocrat, you won't have a career at the top levels of the Chinese Communist Party. So, of course, there are purges on and off. We all know that. Of course, it's an immense organization, and the mind boggles how they organize themselves, in fact, and how they manage to organize not only the government of 1.4 billion people, but their interactions with the provincial governments, because these provinces, some of them are as powerful as Beijing. For instance, the province of Guangdong in the south that has Guangzhou, wow, it's an absolute powerhouse. And it's close to Hong Kong and Macau on top of it. Beijing, Tianjin, that area, wow, it's one of the top GDPs in the world in itself. So, and a level of modernization that is absolutely mind-boggling. So how do they do it in the long term? Central planning, long term. The 5-year plans, subsequent 5-year plans, they have already planned everything to 2035 at least. So this means 3 subsequent 5-year plans since 2025. Since 2020, if I remember well. 2020, they were already thinking about 2035. Another example in high tech. When they came up with this idea of Made in China 2025, which was 10 years ago, way before Trump 1.0. Trump 1.0, they slapped their first tariffs on China in 2018, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Right.
So 2000, the idea, okay, they planned for 10 years. They said, okay, in 10 years, we're going to arrive in 2025. If not as leaders, at least number 2 or number 3 in these 10 high-tech sectors. What's happening now? They are leaders in 7, perhaps 8, and soon they will be leaders in 10. How do you do that? Central planning, meritocracy, enticing your best minds to stay in China. So you're not going to go to MIT or Silicon Valley, make a career in the US and never come back to China. No, you can go there, study, go wherever, but you come back here and you develop high tech here in Chinese soil, which explains, among other things, the success of Huawei, of DeepSeek, you name it. They left and they came back.
Right.
Well, and now they're even prouder of being Chinese, because when they see the actual fruits of the development in front of them every day, of course. And this is something that we feel, Larry, in small details here and there, this sense of self-confidence, especially young Chinese people.
Well, are you familiar with, there's a guy on YouTube, Kevin Walmsley, he does Inside China Business.
Yes.
Yeah, so, and, one of the, he always shows this amazing side of China, just like what you're describing, that you see the modernization. But he also said that within this last 2 years, as the tensions with the United States have increased, the Chinese upper class that could afford to send their kids to schools in the United States are no longer sending them. They are keeping them at home. And in fact, those Chinese that have studied in the West, particularly in the United States, when they come back, they're actually unemployable, or they're having trouble finding jobs.
Yes. Yeah.
So, and I don't think most people here in the United States have caught up or captured, again, this fundamental change in the relationship, that China is through being subservient. China is through kowtowing to the West.
That's over. And well, for certain, I would say, strategic sectors of the American ruling classes, They will never admit that.
Yeah. No, I
It will
agree.
be immensely painful to admit that, but this is reality now. For instance, we don't need American universities. We have Tsinghua. Tsinghua is probably the #1 scientific university in the world now. Not to mention the other ones.
Yeah.
Right? Huawei. Oh my God. I had a crash course on that trifold Huawei that turns into an iPad. But it's something absolutely mind-boggling. It's expensive. It costs $3,000, but it's worth it.
Yeah.
It's worth every bite of it. And the guy was wonderful. He said, I know the problem is you really cannot use it in the West, and it's very risky. There is a trick. If we install one app, this app can, absorb the Western apps like Google and all that, but there's no guarantee that it will keep working. So, but when you look at the technology, you see how much ahead of any crap that Apple is doing. It's absolutely mind-boggling.
Yeah.
Even Xiaomi, the new Xiaomi Pro 17, when you compare it to the iPhone Pro 17, it's a joke. It's much, much better. And fraction of the cost. The SUVs, Larry, is absolutely extraordinary. Not to mention the tank jeeps. If I lived there, I would buy a tank jeep. Definitely.
Yeah.
It's small, compact, very, very powerful, maneuverability excellent, super price, and it's no wonder they are kicking the Japanese out of the market.
Dude, I don't know if I've seen them in Moscow, but I guess they are exporting them to Moscow now, right?
Yes, the Russians love the tank jeeps. Well, not to mention the luxury SUVs.
Yeah, yeah. So this, as you got farther west in China, they're not really paying much attention to what's going on with the international affairs.
No, absolutely. The feeling, Larry, is that the West not only disappears, but in many aspects does not even exist.
Mm-hmm.
It registers in a few brands. When you look at a Gucci shop somewhere, they're here. And they don't buy it anymore. Which is, for instance, I went to can you imagine? I am in Lanzhou, which is a tier 4 city. So I left the museum and I bumped into a super sleek high-tech mall, and all the shops of Western brands, they were totally empty. And when people were buying, they were buying Chinese brands.
Mm-hmm.
And Chinese brands of, let's say, mid-level, but excellent craftsmanship, very, very good prices. Some of them are ultra modern, everything, the logos, you name it, styles comparable to anything you find in the West. So they really don't need it anymore. And wow, and when there are comments about the progressive suicide of Western civilization, this is something that I talked a little bit in Beijing and in Xi'an. They're puzzled. But they say, okay, but they're doing this to themselves.
Yeah, yeah.
we Chinese, we are taking care of ourselves.
I think maybe a unconscious or conscious realization that the world is moving away from the United States, not moving towards it. Trump made a comment about how right now the United States is the hottest, the best, the most exciting place, the freest. And all you have to do is now go to China or go to Russia. There are, you'll see cities, multiple cities in China that the United States doesn't have anything with all of its cities combined that can compare with what China has accomplished. So China and Russia are cutting a new path forward as partners. They're doing it through BRICS. They're doing it through the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. We're awaiting President Putin's remarks at the Vladivostok International Economic Forum. But what we're seeing is the birth of something new. I would not be surprised to see the United Nations become increasingly irrelevant, and that a movement develops to create a BRICS organization with all the nations involved. They can operate in some measure like the United Nations once did, but it would be under, let's call it, better management. Right now, the situation with France and England, or the United Kingdom, holding veto power in the UN Security Council is absurd. They should they're no more entitled to that than any other country in Europe. It should be based primarily upon economic power. To that end, yes, the United States, India, China, and Russia should definitely be seated at that table. But how it's sorted out with determining a representative from Africa and a representative from South America, most likely BRICS, or Brazil as part of BRICS. But these are the changes that are coming down the pike. I think we're going to see a significant economic crisis in the West. No telling how far the contagion of that will spread. And we'll see significant military progress by Russia with respect to Ukraine. And as the war in Ukraine winds down, and as Russia, China, and India emerge as the new economic powers in the world, perhaps we'll have a way forward to peace. But right now, everything is in play.